defied a superpower and outlived an economy. Meet Nicolás Maduro, the world's ultimate survival artist. The narrative arc of Nicolás Maduro, from a privileged but physically frail existence in the sense of his early obscurity to becoming the 35th president, or rather, the successor of the Bolivarian dream. It's incomprehensible without first acknowledging the foundational years spent not in the halls of academia, but by behind the wheel of a city bus. Long before he walked the corridors of Miraflores Palace, Maduro was maneuvering through the chaotic, sun-drenched, and politically charged streets of Caracas as a Metrobus driver. It was in this humble setting, amidst the daily grind of the working class, that he discovered his true voice. He did not find his calling in the fine print of policy or the nuances of economics, but in the raw energy of protest and the collective power of the labor movement. Rising as a formidable trade union leader within the Caracas metro system during the 1990s, his tall, imposing stature and booming, resonant voice commanded attention during strikes and rallies. He became a man of the people, for the people, laying a radical ideological groundwork centered on socialist resistance. This grassroots activism eventually caught the eye of a jailed revolutionary named Hugo Chavez, a meeting of destinies that would forever alter his trajectory, transforming him from a simple transit worker into a rising political titan within the burgeoning Chavista movement. During these formative years, Maduro was not just a driver, he was a silent observer of the societal decay that plagued Venezuela's Fourth Republic. He witnessed the stark inequality from his driver's seat, seeing the shanty towns clinging to the hillsides while the oil elite lived in fortified luxury. This visual contrast fueled a simmering resentment that would later underpin his entire political ideology. His role in the Union was his first taste of real power. He learned how to paralyze a city, how to negotiate with management, from a position of strength, and how to maintain discipline among a diverse group of workers. These were the raw materials of autocracy, forged in the heat of labor disputes. When Chavez launched his failed coup in 1992, Maduro was among the devoted few who visited him in the Yare prison, acting as a courier and a bridge between the incarcerated leader and the civilian movements. He wasn't just a follower, he was becoming the connective tissue of a revolution, a man whose loyalty was tested in the shadows long before it was paraded on the national stage. The ascent of Nicolás Maduro remains one of the most improbable climbs in modern political history, begging the question, how does a man with no formal university degree or traditional pedigree reach the absolute pinnacle of international diplomacy and legislative power? The answer lies in an unwavering, almost religious loyalty to Hugo Chavez. This absolute devotion acted as a high-octane fuel for his career, propelling him with startling speed through the ranks of the Venezuelan government. Maduro was not a man of independent policy or creative governance. Rather, he was the ultimate loyalist, a true believer, who executed orders with precision and zeal. He rose to become the president of the National Assembly and then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, where he spent years serving as the global face of the Bolivarian Revolution. In the international arena, he forged controversial and strategic alliances with anti-Western regimes, from the Castros in Cuba to the leadership in Tehran and Moscow, positioning Venezuela as a key player in a new, multipolar world. Throughout this tenure, he proved himself to be Chavez's most trusted enforcer, a man who stayed by the leader's side while other more intellectually independent rivals were sidelined or purged. He learned the delicate dance of international summits while never losing his rugged street fighter edge. As foreign minister, he was the primary architect of the Petro-Carib initiative, using Venezuela's vast oil wealth to buy political influence across the Caribbean and Central America, creating a regional voting bloc that would later protect the regime from sanctions at the OAS. He was also instrumental in the creation of CELAC and UNASUR, regional bodies designed specifically to exclude the United States and Canada. His lack of a formal degree was often mocked by the elite, but Maduro wore it as a badge of honor, a symbol of his proletarian roots that made him more relatable to the masses than the Harvard-educated technocrats of the opposition. He was the Canciller del Pueblo, Chancellor of the People, a man who could speak to both a factory worker and a head of state, always keeping his true intentions. Hidden behind a facade of revolutionary rhetoric and absolute obedience to his commander, we are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. The moment of transition was both somber and historic, a scene that would define the future of South America for decades to come. In a televised broadcast in December 2012, the world saw a visibly weakened and gaunt Hugo Chavez, who for the first time seemed to acknowledge his mortality. In this address, he stunned the nation and his own party by explicitly naming Nicolás Maduro as his chosen heir. He did not merely suggest a successor, he issued a direct plea to the Venezuelan people, asking them to cast their votes for Maduro, as if for me should the worst happen. This was far more than a simple political endorsement. It was a spiritual and ideological transfer of the eternal commander's mantle. This moment was heavy with the weight of religious symbolism, almost resembling a biblical passing of the torch. By framing Maduro as the keeper of the flame, Chavez effectively crowned him in the eyes of the devoted Chavista base, ensuring that his own charisma would be posthumously draped over his successor. This act framed any future opposition to Maduro not just as a political disagreement, but as a direct betrayal of Chavez's dying wish and the revolution itself. Shortly after this broadcast, Chavez succumbed to cancer in a veil of state secrecy, leaving Maduro to step out of the giant's shadow and into a role for which many believed he was fundamentally unprepared. The months following Chavez's death were a masterclass in political stagecraft. Maduro and his team transformed the funeral into a multi-week marathon of mourning, positioning Maduro as the son of Chavez. He famously claimed that Chavez had appeared to him in the form of a little bird to give him his blessing, a move that was ridiculed by the urban elite but resonated deeply with the spiritual and syncretic traditions of many poor Venezuelans. He wasn't just running a campaign, he was managing a cult of personality that had lost its center, desperately trying to graft himself onto the legend of a man who was already being canonized as a secular saint. The weight of the crown was immediate and crushing. It's evidenced by the 2013 special election held in the wake of Chavez's massive state-sponsored funeral. While Chavez had dominated the polls with double-digit leads and a charismatic grip on the electorate, Maduro faced a much harsher reality. He barely scraped past the opposition leader Enrique Capriles with a victory margin of less than 2%, a difference of only about 200,000 votes out of 15 million cast. This razor-thin win was a seismic shock to the system, instantly exposing a deeply polarized and fractured Venezuela. The election was immediately marred by fierce and credible allegations of irregularities, voter intimidation, and outright fraud, which the opposition used to challenge Maduro's legitimacy from day one. Capriles refused to recognize the result, demanding a full audit of every single ballot, a request that the government-controlled National Electoral Council (CNE) systematically obstructed. It became clear in an instant that while Maduro had inherited the titles, the palaces, and the military command, he had not inherited the genuine, cult-like love that the people had for his predecessor. This shaky start set a permanent tone for his presidency, one defined by a constant state of defensiveness, a siege mentality, and a perpetual crisis of legitimacy. He found himself ruling a nation where half the population viewed him as a usurper, forcing him to rely more on the iron fist and the machinery of state control than on the genuine populist mandate that Chavez had enjoyed. To compensate for his lack of personal magnetism, Maduro intensified the state of exception, using the judicial system to target those who questioned the election results. The initial protests against the result were met with a swift and violent response, signaling that the new era of Chavismo would be significantly more repressive than the old. He began his term not with a gesture of reconciliation, but with a declaration of war against half of his own citizenry. As Maduro struggled to consolidate his domestic authority, a global economic storm was brewing that would devastate the nation's foundations. Venezuela's fate had long been tied to a single volatile commodity: oil. The country was a textbook petrostate, relying on crude oil for a staggering 96% of its export revenue. In 2014, the global oil market crashed, with prices tumbling from over $100 a barrel to less than $30, and with it, the rug was pulled out from under the Bolivarian dream. The immense, multi-billion-dollar social programs, the misiones that had sustained the poor and bought the loyalty of the masses, suddenly became financially unsustainable. The crash didn't just lower revenue, it exposed decades of systemic mismanagement, rampant corruption within the state oil company PDVSA, and a total lack of economic diversification. Under Chavez's PDVSA had been hollowed out, its technical experts replaced by political loyalists, and its maintenance budgets diverted to fund social spending. When the price crashed, the company didn't have the reserves or the expertise to weather the storm. Instead of implementing painful reforms, cutting spending, or seeking international assistance from the IMF, the Maduro administration doubled down on failed policies. They plunged the government into a desperate financial spiral, resorting to the only survival mechanism they knew: printing money at an exponential rate to cover the massive fiscal deficit. This decision would ignite one of the worst economic collapses in human history, proving that a nation built on oil alone is a house built on sand. The government also maintained a complex and corrupt system of multiple exchange rates, which allowed those close to the regime to buy dollars at a fraction of their true cost and sell them on the black market for astronomical profits, further draining the nation's coffers while the common people began to starve. The resulting economic carnage transformed the daily lives of Venezuelans into a surreal nightmare of survival. Under Maduro's stewardship, the country entered a death spiral of hyperinflation that defied traditional economic models, reaching rates so high, peaking at over 1.7 million percent in 2018, that they became difficult to track accurately. Prices began to double every few weeks, then every few days, effectively rendering the national currency, the bolivar, worthless. A cup of coffee or a loaf of bread eventually cost millions, then billions of bolivars, necessitating the use of scales to weigh stacks of cash rather than counting them. This monetary collapse wiped out the life savings of the middle class overnight and pushed the poor into literal starvation. This period became known as the Maduro Diet, a grim euphemism for the reality where severe shortages of basic food, medicine, and hygiene products forced millions of citizens to scavenge through garbage heaps for scraps. The humanitarian catastrophe was absolute. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics and electricity, and children began to die of malnutrition in a country that sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. People began to sell their most prized possessions, wedding rings, family heirlooms, even their hair, just to buy a few days' worth of corn flour. The psychological toll was immense, as a once proud nation was reduced to a state of desperate begging and bartering. Maduro's government, meanwhile, maintained a facade of normalcy in state media, showcasing images of well-stocked markets that only existed for the elite, while the reality on the ground was one of hollowed-out lives and broken dreams. In some regions, people reverted to a barter economy, swapping shoes for eggs or gasoline for medicine. The sense of total societal breakdown was pervasive, as the basic functions of a modern state, electricity, water, security, began to fail systematically across the country. When a leader can no longer provide the basic necessities of life, the relationship between the state and the people inevitably turns to one of open conflict. As public anger boiled over into massive nationwide protests in 2014 and again in 2017, the Maduro administration made a final decisive break from democratic pretense. The government's response was characterized by a level of brutality unseen in Venezuela for generations. Maduro deployed not only the National Guard, but also colectivos, armed, pro-government civilian gangs that operated as paramilitary death squads to terrorize neighborhoods and suppress dissent with lethal force. These colectivos were often given motorcycles and government-issued weapons, acting as a shadow army that could commit atrocities with plausible deniability. The streets of Caracas, San Cristobal, and Valencia were transformed into urban battlegrounds, filled with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition. Thousands of young protesters, often armed with nothing more than Molotov cocktails and makeshift shields, were arrested. Many were subjected to horrific torture in secret prisons, and hundreds were killed in the streets. The 2017 protests, sparked by the Supreme Court's attempt to dissolve the National Assembly, lasted for over 100 days and resulted in more than 160 deaths. The message from the Miraflores Palace was chillingly clear to the world. The regime valued its own survival and the preservation of its power far more than the lives or the democratic rights of its citizens. These protests were not just about politics, they were about the right to exist, the right to eat, and the right to a future. By crushing these movements, Maduro signaled that he was willing to rule over a graveyard if it meant keeping his seat. The international community watched in horror as videos of armored vehicles running over protesters and snipers firing from rooftops flooded social media, marking the definitive transformation of Venezuela into a pariah state under Maduro's iron-fisted command. The regime even began using military courts to try civilian protesters, a blatant violation of international law. Realizing that he could no longer win a fair fight within the existing legal framework or through the hearts and minds of the people, Maduro moved to dismantle the very architecture of the Venezuelan state. In 2015, the opposition won a landslide victory in the National Assembly, gaining a two-thirds majority that threatened to use their legislative power to check Maduro's authority, investigate government corruption, and potentially trigger a recall referendum. Maduro's response was a masterclass in autocratic survival, a constitutional coup. He first used a lame duck session of the old legislature to pack the Supreme Court with loyalists. These judges then systematically issued rulings that invalidated every law passed by the new opposition-led assembly. In 2017, he bypassed the elected legislature entirely by orchestrating the creation of a parallel body called the Constituent National Assembly, ANC. This new body was packed 100% with regime loyalists, including his own wife, Cilia Flores, and his son, Nicolásito, and was given supreme power to rewrite the Constitution and pass laws. This maneuver effectively stripped the democratically elected National Assembly of all its functions, leaving it as a hollow shell with no real authority. By creating his own legislature, Maduro gained the ability to rule by decree and eliminate the last remaining institutional checks and balances. The separation of powers was dead, and the republic was officially transformed into a centralized autocracy, where the law was whatever the president and his inner circle said it was. This was a surgical strike against the heart of Venezuelan democracy, turning the Constitution into a weapon of the executive rather than a shield for the people. The ANC became a tool for political persecution, stripping opposition deputies of their parliamentary immunity and forcing many into exile or prison. The consolidation of power was accompanied by a systematic campaign of human rights abuses that drew the horrified gaze of the international community. Various global organizations, including the United Nations and Human Rights Watch, began documenting a chilling pattern of state-sponsored terror designed to eliminate any form of organized opposition. Reports emerged of arbitrary detentions without trial, systematic use of torture in intelligence prisons like the notorious El Helicoide, where inmates were subjected to electric shocks, beatings, waterboarding, and psychological warfare, and thousands of extrajudicial executions. A particularly feared instrument of this repression was the FAES, Special Action Forces, a police unit that functioned essentially as a political hit squad. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, issued a landmark report stating that the FAEs had carried out thousands of killings under the guise of resisting authority in poor neighborhoods to eliminate dissent and intimidate the most vulnerable. These were not isolated incidents of police overreach, but part of a calculated top-down strategy known as the Operation Liberation of the People, OLP, to paralyze the population through fear. The scale and systematic nature of these abuses eventually led the International Criminal Court to open a formal investigation into the Maduro regime for crimes against humanity, marking the first time a South American leader had been so targeted while still in office. For Maduro, these atrocities were the necessary cost of doing business to maintain his grip on a country that had largely turned against him, creating a culture of impunity where the state security forces became the nation's greatest threat. Every dissenting voice, from journalists to student leaders, lived under the constant threat of the suntan, a euphemism for the Azeb in intelligence service, knocking on their door in the middle of the night. The combination of political terror and economic ruin eventually triggered a human catastrophe of biblical proportions. The Venezuelan migrant crisis. As the quality of life vanished and the threat of state violence loomed, millions of Venezuelans were forced to make a heartbreaking choice: stay and starve, or leave everything behind. This led to the largest displacement of people in Latin American history. With over 7 million citizens, more than 20% of the population, fleeing the country, they left on foot, carrying their lives in backpacks, crossing the treacherous Andes Mountains and the dangerous jungles of the Darien Gap in search of safety. This exodus was not just a humanitarian tragedy, it was a demographic collapse that gutted the nation's future. Venezuela was drained of its most vital resources: its doctors, engineers, teachers, and its youth, the very people needed to rebuild. What remained was a ghost country of the elderly and the extremely poor, while neighboring nations like Colombia, Peru, and Brazil struggled to absorb the massive tide of refugees, straining regional resources and social services. This mass departure served Maduro's interests in a dark and cynical way. It removed the most motivated and frustrated segment of the population. While the remittances sent back by those who fled became a vital source of foreign currency for the collapsing economy, the regime essentially turned its own people into an export. Profiting from their desperation while ridding itself of its most vocal critics, the loss of human capital is perhaps the most permanent damage Maduro has inflicted on the nation. As an entire generation of Venezuelans is now being raised in foreign lands, disconnected from their heritage and unlikely to return as long as the regime remains in power, by 2019, the crisis reached a surreal geopolitical impasse that left the world wondering who was actually in charge of the country. Following a 2018 re-election that was widely dismissed as a sham by the international community due to the disqualification of major opposition candidates and parties, the opposition took a bold stand. Juan Guaidó, the young and relatively unknown head of the National Assembly, invoked Article 233 of the Constitution to declare himself the legitimate interim president, arguing that Maduro was a usurper because the election was invalid. Within days, Guaidó was recognized by the United States and over 50 other democratic nations as the rightful leader of Venezuela. What followed was a bizarre, intense period of dual presidency that played out on the world stage. Guaidó held massive rallies, controlled some foreign assets like Citgo and the gold reserves in the Bank of England, and was received as a head of state in world capitals, but he lacked the one thing required to actually govern: its control over the state apparatus on the ground. Despite the intense diplomatic pressure, a series of failed military uprisings, such as the one on April 30, 2019, and the humanitarian aid standoff at the borders, Maduro maintained the only vote that truly mattered in an autocracy: the unwavering loyalty of the military top brass. He had bought their allegiance through control of lucrative state industries, mining concessions in the mining arc of the Orinoco and the illegal gold and drug trade. Guaidó was left with the international titles, the speeches, and the recognition. But Maduro kept the guns, the prisons, the palace, and the bureaucracy, proving that, in a dictatorship, legitimacy is often secondary to the control of brute force and the ability to distribute illicit spoils to the military elite. As the diplomatic standoff dragged on, the United States escalated its efforts to force Maduro out by launching a maximum pressure campaign of economic warfare. Washington imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, the lifeblood of the regime, aiming to cut off Maduro's access to the global financial system and hard currency. The goal was to starve the regime of resources until the military finally turned against him, or the government collapsed from within. However, Maduro proved to be a resilient and resourceful survivor of international isolation. He countered the American blockade by deepening strategic and military ties with a survival axis composed of Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. These allies provided the regime with technical means to circumvent sanctions, selling oil on the black market through ghost fleets and shipping gold to foreign treasuries in exchange for cash and supplies. Russia provided military advisors and financial support, while Iran helped restart the nation's rotting oil refineries. Domestically, Maduro used the sanctions as a powerful propaganda tool, blaming every government failure, from food shortages to frequent and devastating nationwide blackouts, on Yankee imperialism and a criminal blockade. The sanctions, while devastating to the general population and accelerating the humanitarian crisis, failed to topple the ruling class, who managed to maintain their lavish lifestyles and secure power through illicit trade and the support of anti-Western partners. The regime learned to turn the economy into a dark survival system where gold from illegal mines in the south became the new reserve currency, allowing them to maintain the loyalty of the military despite the collapse of the Bolivar. Throughout his decade in power, Nicolás Maduro has proven to be an unexpected and cunning master of political survival, defying almost every prediction of his imminent downfall. His survival is not based on popularity, charisma, or economic success, but on a sophisticated and multi-layered playbook of control and co-optation. He utilizes state-controlled media to create a permanent alternate reality where he is the hero of the people, fighting against a global conspiracy. He maintains a grip on the poor through the CLAP program, subsidized food boxes distributed through local party committees, Consejos Comunales, which are used as a tool of social control. If you don't support the party, you don't eat. He has masterfully fragmented the opposition parties, using the Supreme Court to hand over leadership of those parties to regime-friendly puppets and bribing some politicians to act as a loyal opposition, the so-called allocranes. Perhaps most importantly, he has created a Praetorian Guard of generals who are so deeply involved in state corruption, illegal mining, and drug trafficking, the so-called cartel of the Suns, that they know their own survival and freedom are tied directly to his. He has also utilized a sophisticated network of Cuban intelligence officers, G2, to monitor and purge the Venezuelan military of any potential dissenters, by co-opting the judicial system, the electoral council, and the military. He has built a fortress around Miraflores Palace that has withstood multiple coup attempts, assassination plots involving explosive drones, and total economic collapse. He has learned that as long as he controls the hungry and the armed, he can ignore the world and the will of his own people. His resilience is a testament to the effectiveness of a modern dictatorship that combines 20th century repression with 21st century digital surveillance and global illicit financial networks. The most recent test of this survival machine came in July 2024, during a presidential election that many hoped would finally provide a path toward a democratic transition. The Venezuelan people, despite years of repression and despair, turned out in massive numbers to support the opposition candidate Edmundo González, was backed by the charismatic and widely popular leader Maria Corina Machado. Pato, though barred from running herself by the regime's court, had spent years building a grassroots movement that bypassed traditional party structures. The atmosphere was electric, with a sense of hope that hadn't been felt in a decade. However, the Maduro-controlled National Electoral Council (CNE) declared Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote shortly after midnight, providing no supporting evidence and refusing to release the detailed voting tallies actas from individual polling stations. Meanwhile, the opposition performed a logistical and technological miracle, collecting and publishing their own digital copies of over 80% of the tally sheets, actas from polling stations across the country on a public website. These documents showed a landslide victory for González with over 67% of the vote, compared to Maduro's 30%. This blatant disregard for the will of the voters sparked a fresh wave of international condemnation and violent domestic unrest. The world once again saw the regime's true face as it launched Operation Tantan, Knock Knock, moving to arrest thousands of protesters and threaten opposition leaders with long prison sentences. The 2024 election reinforced the grim reality that under Maduro's rule, the ballot box is no longer a tool for democratic change, but merely a piece of theater used to provide a thin veneer of legitimacy to a regime that has no intention of ever relinquishing power. It was a clear signal that the regime had transitioned from a hybrid democracy to a full-blown naked dictatorship that no longer cares about its international image, relying solely on terror and the support of other autocratic states to survive. Today, the nation of Venezuela exists in a state of suspended animation, a tragic and broken landscape trapped between a resilient, adaptive authoritarian regime and a population that remains desperate for dignity, bread, and freedom. The legacy of Nicolás Maduro is already written in the deep scars of the global diaspora, the ruins of a once great national economy, and the harrowing poverty statistics that define a land that should be one of the wealthiest in the world. He has transformed a vibrant, albeit flawed, democracy into a cautionary tale for the 21st century, a case study in how populist rhetoric, systemic corruption, and the erosion of institutions can lead to the total collapse of a modern state. Maduro has managed to survive where others would have fallen, but his victory is a Pyrrhic one, presiding over a nation that has lost its soul and its future. The once mighty oil industry is a shadow of its former self. The infrastructure is crumbling, and the social contract is completely severed. Yet, the final chapter of his rule has not yet been composed. As the world watches, Venezuela remains a dangerous wildcard in global politics, a nation whose future will determine whether it fades into the quiet, permanent silence of a Caribbean dictatorship or erupts once more. In a final climactic struggle for its very soul, the story of Nicolás Maduro is far from over, but the cost of his survival is already higher than most nations could ever hope to pay, leaving a legacy of rubble, resilience, and a deep-seated longing for a return to normalcy. The people of Venezuela continue to wait, their spirit unbowed, but their bodies weary, wondering if the dawn will ever break. On the long dark night of the Maduro era, or if they are destined to remain in the shadows of a revolution that promised them heaven, but delivered them to a living hell. The resilience of the Venezuelan people in the face of such overwhelming odds remains the only true glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark and desolate narrative.